Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, Darren King. And Darren, we're in the middle of summer right now. It's been pretty hot in Western North Carolina. There's that sense in which things are beginning to change, though. We've had a lot of rain lately. There's movement all around us, and I like it. I like that we have these shifts in the season. We have these movements of climate and also movements and habits that we find in our own selves and lives. So it's been a good time for me. It's been a while. How have you been? I want to catch up with you. What's going on with you?
Well, first of all, I want to say I totally agree. I'm somebody who really appreciates having 4 seasons. I know some people talk about wishing they could move to a tropical location where you basically just have hot and pretty warm. But for me, I like to experience all 4 seasons. Now, within moderation, I don't like to be too cold or too hot. And I find that where we are in Western North Carolina is the perfect balance, where we're a couple thousand feet above sea level, and that gives you kind of more moderate summers, and winters are not too intensely cold either. In fact, I remember this last year I went riding my motorbike on Christmas Day, so definitely not your typical mountain experience. But other than that, just my usual, being knee-deep in the weeds on this topic, which has to do with what we're going to talk about today in terms of how you progress in metabolizing these kinds of elements, where it's not just this on-off kind of switch on whether or not you believe UFOs are real or not, but there's many, many degrees of integration you have to metabolize to really make sense of the fullness of what this is. And ultimately, it stops at the shoreline of the nature of reality itself.
Does indeed. Well, many of our listeners may not know this, but occasionally you and I do have a chance to get together and have pizza. That's one of the things we like to do when we have a chance to catch up in person. And, I pretty much could tell kind of what Darren likes on his pizza at this point. We've done this so many times, I'm sure dozens and dozens of times at this point. But it makes me think a little bit about my kids, too. So, like, when I go get pizza with my kids, I'm like, what do you want on your pizza? What do you want to, would you try this? I would never try that. Well, maybe try this instead. You kind of have to ease them into different toppings so they finally feel like they might like something new. And, I'm using this as a bit of a backdrop to what we are going to get into, because the word indigestible has been thrown around recently in terms of aspects of the phenomena that may be difficult for people to really come to terms with. And here I'm referring to the great interview that was done with James Indoli and Jim Semivan, where Jim talks about how the reality of the phenomena could be indigestible for society. And then James followed that great interview with another one with Peter Levenda, where Levenda spoke directly about that concept of indigestible, and expounded on that a little bit more. But the entire time, I, of course, was thinking about how do I metabolize this information? And that has been a word that you've introduced into my lexicon handbag for the phenomena. It's a different kind of handbag than the other one we talked about. And we thought it would be really good to walk through, like you said, different concepts that are digestible pieces of what this may be, because you can't necessarily go from A to Z. You've really got to go through this process of digesting, metabolizing different aspects of what the phenomena might represent. And I think landing too on the place that you're never done. This is not a finished exercise, that you just as we living beings have to continue to consume in order to have enough energy to do the things that we do to live. And this is a similar process for disclosure. It's something that will always have to be absorbed and evaluated and digested, and then process repeats itself ad nauseum. So I'm really excited to get into this. I know you've got a whole lineup of topics, so I'm going to turn it over to you to get started with this. Where do you want to begin?
Right, so in a minute, we're going to begin with the notions that are the most palatable to the masses, and then move into increasingly difficult things for people to grok and metabolize ultimately. But before we jump in, I just want to comment on what you said about James' great couple of interviews with Semivan and Levenda. I liked the way the Levenda provided some context around what Semivan said. So Semivan spoke about his colleagues higher up with the more 30,000-foot view deciding this was indigestible. Now, a lot of people made the assumption that he was saying that to modern humanity, this would be indigestible. Levenda added the context where he said, to the military-industrial complex, this is indigestible because they have a certain way of framing reality, threat or not, foe or friend, right? And he's saying from that kind of vantage point, this is a nonsensical matter. You just can't reduce it to those kinds of options. That doesn't mean it's indigestible altogether. It just means it is from that point of view, which speaks to the fact that I think we'll get into today. There's always a relationship between the observer and the information. And we can't ignore that how much people can metabolize these different elements we're going to talk about that are increasingly out there or fringe, but at the same time well supported by the lore, is largely determined by where you stand now, what your background is. We both come from a background where ambiguity is something we enjoy. It's kind of like going to a smorgasbord. I'll try a little bit of Chinese food, a little bit of Indian food, a little bit of pizza. We enjoy that. And we don't feel like we have to double down on, listen, do you like pizza or do you like Italian food? Let me know what it is, right? We're comfortable with that kind of cosmopolitan perspective. You were mentioning to me even last time we had pizza that you like to go to New York City because you get that sense of the world is represented there, all these different people groups, and it's kind of a spiritual experience. So that is a perspective that makes a lot more digestible to us than might be digestible to some other people that have a different kind of background. Some people who have had a lot of trauma, for instance, and tend to quickly have to assess is something a threat or not, don't enjoy ambiguity for the very reason that it makes them feel unsafe. Because until they can determine, is this a threat or not, they feel like they're in a vulnerable position. You and I, again, partly because of our privileged backgrounds, have not had that experience, so it changes how we look at these things, how we work with these things. So just want to introduce that so the audience thinks about the role that each of us plays and how do we make sense of these things. It's definitely not a one-dimensional kind of process. All right. So I'm going to state the first one, which I think is fairly obvious, and it's something that the mainstream is pretty happy to embrace, and largely this is the perspective already. And I'll turn it over to you for some brief thoughts on that, and that is the notion that we are not alone in the universe. There are other kinds of sophisticated intelligence in the cosmos. What are your thoughts about that one?
I mean, I think that's a given. I think you're right. I think most of our society, maybe not all of it, but most, agree at this point that we're not the only form of life in the universe. It's just too big. The numbers are too big. The scale is too large. Yes, we're still trying to find it, quote unquote, with our detection devices and whatnot. But it strikes me as it's only a matter of time to where one of our instruments, eventually comes to this in our process, eventually come to the conclusion that yes, it's not just on Earth, it's everywhere else. It just may be, difficult for us to see it, or it was. So totally agree. We're not alone. I don't think we're alone on this planet. That's sort of the other, component here. And, I think most of the world is there. I think it hasn't always been that way. So I'll leave it at that. When I was growing up, and I know you'll remember this too, it certainly wasn't always thought that was the case. And this is part of the religious background, at least in the West, that, sort of Earth was this special thing. Human life was also very special because of this divine human relationship, and it wouldn't be anywhere else because all life just was created and exists here only on this planet. So a lot of folks certainly took that perspective, and it took a while for the mainstream to come along and eventually agree that, maybe we're not the only life that's out there.
That's a great point. And in addition to those of us who've had at some point a religious influence on how we look at these things, there's also the matter of when we were growing up, telescopes weren't peering nearly as far into the cosmos. And so we had limited data at that point. And we did think that planet Earth and our solar system was probably pretty unique. Now we find that it's pretty typical, actually. And that even though Earth-like planets are in the minority, because of the vastness of the universe, there's still a plethora of them, many, 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 many kinds of Earth-like planets, which could support life in terms of having a water-based kind of planet with an atmosphere at a certain distance from its sun, where it's kind of in that Goldilocks zone. Even those are the minority because, again, the sheer number of solar systems and galaxies, it's so plentiful that they should be everywhere. All right, so that is the first one. We're pretty clear on that one. That's not difficult to grok. In fact, most people are already there, but you make a great point that has not always been the case, even in our lifetime. which just shows you how much these things can change. All right, the next one, which you kind of alluded to, is they are not just somewhere in the universe, but they are here on and around the Earth, which of course raises interesting questions about in what way are they here? We don't see them next door. So in what way are they here? How do you make sense of that one? And where do you think people are in terms of metabolizing that notion?
I think for many people, this is that bridge too far. This is very difficult for the mainstream to agree to. Those of us who are interested in this topic, I think unanimously would conclude that they are here, that we're not alone and they are here. And we've all got our different reasons for that. Some of us have had direct experience of this other intelligence that is not human or not conventionally human is the term you like to use. And then some of us just have observed through our own research and conversations that there's a mountain of evidence, maybe not in our own lived experience, but there's enough evidence out there to confidently assert that we're not alone on this planet. So I think it's not easy for most. I think this is kind of the next larger sort of leap to make for most of our civilization. But I think we're very close. I think that if you look at the kinds of developments, advances that we're seeing in our scientific pursuits right now, as well as the generations that are coming along, this concept is becoming a lot more part of the collective than it used to be. Certainly when we were growing up, it's different than then.
Absolutely true. And I think about even since I've been heavily involved in this the last couple of years, how many different academics have weighed in and said they want to study this and are beginning to study this. We're seeing numerous organizations spring up around the world that either want to offer classes and programs in teaching about this or that want to do research to try to understand it. Now, again, I still think those are often with a pretty strong physicalist kind of paradigm, so they've got a ways to go yet, but it's important and it's necessary and it's a good sign that that is happening. And when you have the Schumer Amendment existing that speaks about non-human intelligence and the craft they operate something of 20 times, then clearly we're in different waters than we used to be in. Clearly that's speaking to not just the fact that somewhere in Alpha Centauri or Zeta Reticuli these things might exist, but that they are here, and indeed that the military-industrial complex has known about it and actually has been cooperating even to some degree. So definitely that kind of move that we've seen happen just over the last year or so is definitely moving us in that direction. And to the point you made in our last episode, we can easily forget how much things have changed in the last couple of years and get a little greedy and think, nothing's happened for 2 weeks. I'm getting frustrated here. When you think about people who've been in this for decades, sometimes I run into these people and they're either flabbergasted with the progress we have made, or they've been so bludgeoned into believing this will never change that they're not even seeing the writing on the wall, that we're right on the verge of some sort of official confirmation about this reality. Of course, let me just say that I think it's because of the complicated nature where one truth nugget begets another that makes this difficult, because how do you present this from a podium or something in a way that is tangible enough and doesn't destabilize the society? So this is an ongoing question. Now, something else that I think comes up next is more about how this changes how we see ourselves on the totem pole, on the hierarchy of beings, right? Because part of what this gets to, and you kind of hinted at this a minute ago, if they've actually been here, operating pretty substantially, actually, running some various programs that we'll get into later, then how is it the case they've been able to do this right under our noses without us knowing this as a collective? This speaks to the sophistication they operate with compared to us. So, for instance, their tech makes ours look incredibly rudimentary. So this is another thing that is more of a psychological, sociological issue. It's less about, is this believable, but what does it do to our sense of comfort, knowing that we're going from being the top of the food pyramid, where we make all the decisions about what we do to animals, and we are where the buck stops, to suddenly realizing there are species, entities, intelligences that are asking those questions from a higher place on the pyramid, seemingly. So what do you think about that one and how that one lands for most people?
Before I answer that question, I want to introduce a little bit of an analogy that helps me think about these steps in general. And so I think about it in terms of the sense of a mainland and then a series of islands that are adjacent to the mainland. And right now, most people, we're on the mainland. and we've never been able to leave it. And maybe one day we're walking along the shore and we notice, hey, I think there's another piece of what looks like land that I'm on, but it's out there in the middle of the ocean. And we think, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'd like to go visit that, but I don't know how I'm going to do that. And so the first attempt at getting to that other piece of land is often the very hardest one, just making that first connection, whether it be through swimming or taking a boat or building a bridge. We kind of have to have the courage as well as the determination and the know-how to make that leap to getting to that other territory. And once we've mastered that, then oftentimes the islands that might be adjacent to that other one become a little bit easier to get to, or we might be able to get to them a little bit faster. So I'm introducing that concept because I think to some degree, and we've referred to this as well as kind of like a domino effect in other conversations. I think that's an apt analogy as well. But I like this other one of kind of traversing these different islands. We're going to come back to that a little bit more as we get into the conversation. So in terms of their tech being more advanced, I think that's an easier thing to come to terms with once you realize and affirm that they are here. And the reason I say that is because if they're here, they're really good at avoiding us, really good at not being perceived. It's difficult to interact with them. We've got, everyone knows the grainy videos, the grainy photos. Where's the proof? That's the constant sort of demand. I get that. And so one of the arguments as to why that may be the case is that their technology is so advanced that it makes it very difficult for us to interact with them, to perceive them. We've spent tons of time talking about perception, just in general, our own limited human perception. They might operate outside the bounds of that to some degree. So the fact that they have more advanced technology, to me, is an easier leap if you've already made the prior one that they are here right now.
Right, and just as a quick addition to that, what I'm often struck by is how different astrophysicists, different astronomers and whatnot, various scientists will say, well, there's no way that aliens could be here because of the size of the universe, it would take far too long for them to travel here, even if they could approach the speed of light. Now, again, the issue there is not that that holds true, but actually our understanding of physics is so limited that we don't even understand how they would get here. But rather than grapple with that possibility, again, I think because subtly we don't like the psychological position it puts us in to be so outpaced by these others that we don't even have a clue how they would be here and how they would be so stealthy for so long. It's interesting, too, when you talk about them hiding, because when we think about these reverse engineering programs, one of the major advances in our own technology, in our jet aircraft and whatnot, again, in our lifetimes, is around stealth aircraft, right? These different kind of materials and the way that they're constituted on these aircraft make them very difficult to be perceived by radar. This is fascinating. And it just, again, things speaks to the fact that when you start adding things up, you start saying, wait a second, there's a lot of secondary, kind of tertiary information that supports this notion. But beyond that, there's another thing that makes us, I think, uncomfortable about our relationship to them on this pyramid, because not only do they have technology, which is external, which is how we understand technology, that outpaces ours, but they also seem to be able to change human experience itself. They seem to be able to impact human perception and consciousness. We see this happen regularly as well, which also, again, of course, when you think about it, helps to explain how they could be so stealthy, because when they can not only hide from us, but even when they show themselves to us, they can change our memory in such a way that we don't remember we see them. We also, of course, are aware of situations where 3 people in a car will see something driving down a busy highway. No one else is apparently noticing it. And even what those 3 people see is slightly different. And every one of those 3 experiences is different than what is actually captured on the camera, which is something, but still nothing like what any of the 3 people saw. So this sort of begs a whole series of questions about the nature of reality, about our perception, about their skills, these kinds of things. Even begins to call into question, are they extraterrestrial or something else, something more like what we would have called angels and demons in the past, but bringing up what you talked about in terms of the religious framing.
Well, I like that this follows the technology, the technology being more advanced, because oftentimes you hear individuals talk about this ability to influence consciousness in the context of a technology. And I think that's an important point to dwell on a little bit, because that's the way that many of us would think about that capability. That we don't immediately go to some sort of spookier or fuzzier conception like psi or telepathy, and instead we go, well, they must be using a kind of technology to influence how I'm thinking. They can somehow interact with my brain waves. They can use a device of some sort and affect me physiologically, psychologically. So I think that that's interesting, that it does follow and flow down from that they have technology that is more advanced than ours. And the other thing I would say too is that this relates very closely to what people have reported. So you did touch on this a little bit. We've certainly seen reference to this in prior iterations of legislation, biological effects, and certainly there's a lot of lore about this. And so I think if you've spent any time evaluating experiencer accounts, that if you're looking at that information at all, then this is something that comes up very often, that they felt that they could communicate with these beings without words, that their perception of what was going on was entirely different than what may have really been going on. You talk about a difference in sort of the perception of time as well, the experience of time. They thought it was 30 minutes when it had only been 5 minutes. So these are all sort of downstream effects of their ability to seemingly affect us on a conscious level. And then I think we can debate further later, maybe perhaps, whether that is a technology or whether it's something indicative of the nature of reality itself, or maybe even both of those things, perhaps.
For sure. That's a great point. And I think we do see evidence of both, right? In the sense of clearly they can do things mind to mind. And we've mentioned many times on this show, and I've mentioned it on many other podcasts as well, how psi is wrapped up in all of this. And we, of course, know that human beings also possess psi capacities. So it's not just unique to these beings. Again, these are these subtle hints that point towards the nature of reality, like a road sign pointing into a fog that we may not see very well in terms of detail, but all these different converging fields of data are pointing in that same fog. And we'll get to some of that later. But just to give an example, I know of cases where, for instance, people didn't necessarily have negative experiences with the beings once they had been abducted, for instance, but just the notion of being abducted and it being sudden and them having no warning was so terrifying for some people and discombobulating that I remember some people who literally had guns all around their bed for when this happened. But the second the beings show up and they go to reach for one of these guns, a being will point a baton-like device at the person and they are paralyzed. Again, it's only temporary. But this speaks to, again, the fact that sometimes they can do something seemingly just by looking into the eyes of a grave, for instance, and people talk about the hypnotic effect of looking into those eyes, which might also be a kind of technology, because some people have talked about there might be an overlay over top the actual eye. This is one of the questions that Whitley Strieber introduced in Communion was, is this a mask or is this their actual face? Are they actually helping us psychologically by covering up what might be a face that's more terrifying for us, might look more insect-like or something? But this is fascinating that there is no clear delineation between technologies that are engineered to work with mind-to-mind communication versus ones that use devices in the physical world. Again, these kind of delineations that we're used to get kind of obliterated by this material, and we'll get to some of that later. All right, this is a big one now. As Nathan knows, I spend all my time deep in the weeds in these topics, so this is not difficult stuff for me to grok because I've had a lot of opportunity to be there and a lot of experience. Nathan's going to also chime in with each of these about where he's at in terms of not just being aware of them, but how much it really feels real to him. And there's a difference between being able to entertain ideas and actually being kind of sold on them. So we'll get into some of that. And that brings us to our next point, which is, again, increasingly complex and increasingly consequential for our society to really metabolize and to integrate ultimately. And that's the notion that not only are they here, but perhaps they've always been here, meaning they perhaps even predated Homo sapiens sapiens on the planet, which changes our understandings of this being our planet, quote unquote, and those kinds of things, and then being, quote unquote, visitors, to use a term that Strieber uses in his books. Are they visitors? So that's the question.
Yeah, I like this one a lot. It definitely gets you thinking harder and examining your own confirmation or lack of confirmation in this picture. That is it before Roswell? Does it exist prior to that, or is it after? That's kind of the demarcation point for many people. Did they just kind of arrive, or have they always been around? Here's what I'll say about it. I'll say that, there would have been a time in my life where this would have been very difficult for me to swallow. And here I'm referring back to in my sort of Christian days when I was in seminary, reading the Bible and learning the historical critical method and taking a look at those texts and really taking the perspective that the anecdotes referenced in the Bible about, angelic visitation, about miracles, about, all these sort of phenomena that occur in that text, and just looking at that material and going, yeah, I mean, that's a nice rhetorical device and a narrative device to tell this kind of story. And look, I'll say sometimes that is exactly what it is. Sometimes it is purely a rhetorical device to tell a certain story. And the way stories were told in the Bible and the way they told stories just generally is different than how we tell stories today. We have a different sort of standard of what we think about when we're giving someone information. We don't couch it in the terms that they would have couched it. And we would, if I were to tell Darren that, some had a vision of something and it made me want to go buy, sort of 5 heads of broccoli at the grocery store, he would go, yeah, that's kind of neat. That's like how I understand how you make decisions, but that would be strange today. But in the past, that might have been more normal, more accepted. We've talked about that a lot, this sort of historical perspective. And so that was once my view of these kinds of things, that this sort of strange phenomena wasn't something that really ever occurred in human history, that these were nice sort of fantasy stories that we concocted as we were just kind of getting smarter as we went through our generations. And as I've come to talk with many people and learn more about the phenomena and to be exposed to it, I've come to the conclusion that you have to re-examine that content. You have to go back and treat it much more seriously than we may have done so in the past, certainly in the 20th century, where we've kind of written most of it off. We have to treat that content more seriously. And I'm not just talking about the Bible, I'm talking about all the kinds of records that we have in the human tradition that speak to similar kinds of phenomena, similar experiences with craft in the sky, strange lights in the sky, visitation from non-human entities, recording those visitations, whether that recording be done in statues or some kind of scripture or writings or art. These are things that clearly are part of the human experience. And instead of me just taking a very provincial view of it and going, look at those dumb, idiots in the past and their goofy way of talking about reality that wasn't really true at all. Instead, I look at that and go, maybe there really was something to this that I've written off, that I've discarded with no real good reason why, other than just to say I've been kind of biased and conditioned to think that was silly. But once you realize that people have these kinds of experiences today, well, that then reinvigorates this entire notion and makes me think this is much more plausible and does explain a lot of the things that we see in the recorded record.
Absolutely. I also think about the fact that even for the people who claim that those people in the past were recounting a real event, they would say it's a dreamlike event, or they had a vision, or perhaps there have even been some people who have suggested some of these spiritual traditions began around psychedelics, and it just wasn't mentioned, right? They talk about perhaps in their diet was magic mushrooms, and we're not seeing that mentioned, and we're making the mistake of assuming they were seeing these things in quote-unquote actual reality, which of course raises another question about what is the nature of reality. And again, we'll get more into that later, but I just want to introduce that here because what you find as you entertain each of these increasingly consequential notions is that you have to end up asking yourself, what kind of foundations do I believe are sturdy? What about the way I've seen the world is sufficiently trustworthy that I can still lean on that now? Because what begins to happen is the nature of the data itself begins to call into question some of those foundations. And so then you find yourself not only trying to entertain data and figure out how to make sense of it, but you find yourself standing on quicksand to some degree, where the things you used to believe were sturdy and that allowed you to just focus up no longer is the case. You have to look down as well. And that also means, for instance, in this case, looking within. Who are we? What is available to us in this rich interiority, this journey within, as much as what's available in us expanding our reach into the cosmos by sending spaceships out to explore the universe and whatnot. Something else I want to say, too, that comes up a lot in this topic, and I still think is really underrepresented in terms of it being an issue, is we still have this stubborn desire to want to make things simple and as simple as possible. I understand why we would like to make them as simple as possible, but we have to rely on the data, and we have to be careful not to make leaps just because it creates less cognitive dissonance for us. So, for instance, when we entertain this notion, and I discussed this a little bit in our last episode, that they may have been here all along, we again sometimes reduce that to meaning that, oh, so the Greys and the Nordics have been here all along. But what we mean actually is that sophisticated non-human intelligence has been here. And again, we're not even sure if it's necessarily non-human, non-conventionally human perhaps. We have to be careful about the assumptions that are even baked into the terms we use. The thing is, I think what's much more likely, and I'm going to get into a little bit later about the nature of reality and how this might give hints about this to support this notion, but I have become convinced over time that actually what we perceive as the natural world or the world as it exists and the kinds of beings that are there is just a tiny fraction of the total. So what this really means is that we've been part of a crowded landscape, even though the landscape is different than we think it is, our entire history. It's not necessarily one or two kinds of beings have been here all along, and we need to reduce it to that. So that's something to remember. And so my friend Stuart Davis raised this point to me, and I thought it was a great point. And he was reflecting on something Vallée had built up as an argument, which I again discussed in our last episode. This notion that maybe fairies are just a different way of depicting a gray alien. Some people have even suggested that the way that they show up over time changes based on our cultural expectations. I certainly think that's something we should entertain, and it may be the truth sometimes, but I think we have to be careful, again, not to just assume that's the case because it sounds crafty and clever and psychologically sophisticated, because sometimes they just might be different beings. They're not necessarily always the same kind of being. And I remember the analogy that Stuart used was to say that, so there's this tribe that's on this coastal range, and they're living in this bay, and they see these different things float in. So 2,000 years ago, a whale comes into the bay, and then moves back out again. And then 1,000 years later, someone on a canoe from a neighboring tribe comes in, and then paddles back out again. And then 50 years ago, a nuclear submarine comes into the bay, and then goes back out again. Now, following that same kind of logic, you could say, aha, it's all the guys. This is all one being over time parading as a whale, a canoe, and a nuclear submarine, when actually we would say, no, we know enough contextual history to understand those are just different entities altogether. So we need to be careful, again, just to be wary of why we make certain conclusions, why we lean in certain directions, what are we leaning on to be the case to support those notions. And just because something is convenient and sounds crafty and sophisticated doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth. And even if we entertain those notions, we should hold them lightly while we sort of investigate. All right. So we've got more to get into. And as you're noticing, each time we step in here, it gets more and more complex in terms of what gets called into question. Now, this is related to what we just discussed. So not only the notion that they've been here all along, but that inevitably raises the question, how much have they played a role in our evolution as a species, both in terms of genetics, as well as in terms of our cultural history, our self-understanding, our understanding of the cosmos, our religious traditions that you spoke to earlier. How much have those been either directly or indirectly in the sense of like a cargo cult that DeLong and Lavenda talk about? So what do you think about that when we start not just realizing they may have been here all along, but then, of course, we ask, are our origins naturalistic? Is our development, both genetically and as a culture and as a civilization, naturalistic? What do you think about that and people's ability to grok that kind of possibility?
Well, this one certainly gets a lot harder for various different reasons. So we can tackle it from the religious perspective that this goes against in many ways religious notions of a divine creator creating human beings. Although oddly enough, it has some kinds of parallels as well. Maybe not necessarily God creating humans, but having been created by another intelligence. That's certainly part and parcel to that core concept. Then you can get at it from the, like you mentioned, the naturalistic perspective, the sort of Darwinian evolution, the span of time on the Earth, and just tiny little changes over time have resulted in what we find ourselves to be today. And I think all of us, if you've grown up at all in the West, you've certainly been taught this concept, and it's been pretty much beaten into your head that Darwinian evolution is the way in which life emerged, and it's the way that creatures are what they are now. They evolved from sort of prior kinds of iterations of other creatures, the survival of the fittest, all that kind of thing. So these two different, I think, biases towards this notion in one way or another. But we find that we're having trouble with some of it, with both of them. So if you're in one camp or the other, you certainly have trouble with these perspectives as well. So if you're in the religious camp, you have trouble with that because you have to kind of make sense of what we seemingly have in the historical record and evidence of certain kinds of evolutionary progression. And we don't even go that far back in history where you can see signs that evolution has occurred in things like butterflies or birds, things that may propagate more quickly than human beings. And these changes are pretty obvious. So you can just extrapolate out that would have happened over a long enough stretch of time. So from a religious perspective, that's a direct affront to that kind of thinking, that this creator just sort of waved a magic wand and all of a sudden this creature appeared on the planet. But from the evolutionary perspective, you have issues as well. And we're finding that it's increasingly difficult to prove it out in its entirety as a complete conception of how beings have emerged over evolutionary time, because the time isn't long enough in many cases to arrive at the kinds of beings that are here. And so there's some sense in which that it has happened far more rapidly than we can conceive it to have occurred. And so if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself, well, how did it go? How did it occur faster than we can conceive it to have occurred? And so I lay the foundations here for kind of two different ways of approaching this issue, because I think both of them leave room for this notion that there is an active participant in the life that it is on this earth, and that it may have accelerated and actively participated in the development of life that is here. And we're all also hopefully familiar with the concept of panspermia, that maybe complex life or certain kinds of complex life just arrived on the planet from some other planet through a meteor impact, that kind of thing, and then all of a sudden it took root here, and here we are. So there are all these different kinds of conceptions that, to me at least, make this idea not that implausible. It's sort of a little bit easier to digest, because if I've already agreed that we're not alone and they're here and they've been here all along, and a lot of these beings are humanoid in nature, I have to start thinking, well, geez, maybe I didn't just emerge from a purely evolutionary process, and I emerged through the influence and the participation of a different kind of intelligence.
Right, and I think one of the interesting questions, because I think you're right that it's not a stretch to actually consider that possibility once you sort of add in the other elements. But one of the questions that does emerge is, to what degree is, for instance, the shaping of our religious history direct versus indirect? I know that I have been in the past a little bit critical of some of Tom DeLonge's statements, because he has said pretty much as a bold-faced statement that he believes the evidence suggests that they not only have authored different religions, but they've deliberately authored religions that are in competition with each other, basically, that have different fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality that would put them at war, basically. It would make them see each other as in an adversarial kind of lens. I think that's problematic for numerous reasons. I pointed out, and I think we discussed in one of our earlier episodes, that when you look at the monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions, they're all coming from the same tradition. So this notion that the most predominant religions in the world are actually set up to be in opposition with each other doesn't really match with history. Secondly, if you remember that episode I did on Point of Convergence, where I was talking about, we see this awkward kind of later redaction of earlier traditions where things are tried to piece together in a puzzle that is awkward. You can see where things are kind of jaggedly going together, and you can tell there's kind of an editorial desire to make these things seem smoother than they actually are, and they only do such a good job, once you read it in the original Hebrew, for instance, to see that these seem like two different entities or kinds of beings that they're trying to make a modern believer assume is the same thing, same one thing. So if you're trying to reduce these interactions with NHI, or celestial beings, whatever you want to call them, to a monotheistic religion, you have to basically allow for human beings and then one divine entity and his or her messengers in terms of angels or demons. But again, what we see is that doesn't seem to be depicted in some of those early traditions. So to me, that points to the fact that we have actually been the ones to try to make sense and interpret what these events mean, but they have not been seeded directly from these beings. And sometimes that awkward and inexact process is still evidenced in some of our scriptures today. We see evidence, I think, of these beings just like today, showing up, interacting with people in astounding ways, in discombobulating ways. And then human beings are going to do what human beings do. They try to make sense of it. They try to interpret it. And then what happens is, and I've discussed this on previous episodes, we tend to have a preference for older interpretations just because they're old. So I've often asked this question, are you trying to get me to believe a certain interpretation merely because it's a couple thousand or 3,000 years old? Why is that inherently better? If this phenomenon has been showing up all along, then we have as much ability with direct experience and perhaps even with some of the lessons of objectivity in modern science to come up with at least as good a understanding of what this is as they do.
I want to say, first of all, amen to that, because this is something I struggled with as a young believer, and that was wrestling with this concept that God seemed very active in the text of the Bible and interacting with human beings then, and then the day that I was coming up in, like where was the interaction? Where were the heavenly visitors? I was certainly praying. Lots of people were praying. Where was the communication? Where were the miracles that they were similarly recounted in the Bible? And I couldn't find them, which isn't to say they weren't there. I just wasn't looking in the right places, perhaps, for those things to have occurred. But then I always kept this notion that, that, like you pointed out, that a lot of people have this historical deference that that's when the interaction occurred. That's when it took place. It's not happening at all right now. And that never made any sense to me at all. That if this was very much a living God, an interactive God, whatever, this would be happening all the time throughout all of human history, very active engagement, and that the experiences of the present day, interpreted even through our present day lenses of what those might mean, are equally valid to the experiences that are recounted in these historical texts. So we have this way of just saying, well, I get that you had this vision from Abraham or whatever, but because it wasn't written in the Bible, that's not actually very meaningful or nearly as valuable as this passage from this particular book. I find that to be really problematic from a faith perspective, and from an intellectual perspective. So I agree with you as well. I think it's a bit of a leap to say that the beings directly penned and authored these kinds of religious tenets and structures. I think a phrase comes to mind that my dad often has used, and that is that, children are really great observers, but they're horrible interpreters, right? So if you have kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They listen to everything. They're watching everything that happens around them all the time, but they may have no clue what it might mean. So you might have an interaction with your partner, and you might say something, and the child may take it in an entirely different way than it was intended. Or even a ritual that you perform in your house. They may have no idea what that means, but they know that you're doing it. And so that's what I'm saying. We're the children in this example, and we're observing these things that are taking place, and we're just trying to transcribe them down and say, well, this must be what it is, when that's not what it is at all. So our religious histories may be incredibly poor interpretations of those experiences that occurred at those times.
Absolutely. And again, if you just take some time to look into some of those traditions and some of those texts, you find some peculiar things. Like, for instance, when you see different representatives, different magicians from different traditions battling with the Israelites, for instance, about whose God is more powerful, that begs the question, wait a second, I thought there was only one God. Who are these other beings? Now, again, the more evangelical interpretation in terms of an overlay that happens thousands of years later is that perhaps these were demons or something. But again, that's just a convenient overlay after the fact. When you look at the text as it is, you seem to see evidence for different kinds of non-human intelligence interacting with different people groups, and then after the fact trying to clean that up in our traditions. Something else I want to point out that relates to what you were just discussing there is the fact that what I remember in my early 20s and was going through my Christian period, I remember that it was said that well, God was active at a certain point in human history, and now we have the Bible, so we don't need God to be active because all of his revelation has been recorded in the Bible, and we're good to go from now on. Of course, that's a very Western way of looking at things, and it assumes that you can capture these kinds of notions accurately and sufficiently in words. We already see how all sorts of misinterpretation happens when you have to translate several times over from an original language that also is, of course, attached to original idioms and original cultural context and that kind of thing. You translate it several times over to end up with English, for instance, but then even then, what certain words mean to us is quite different than what those words would have meant to our grandparents. And even some words in our lifetime have shifted in terms of their emphasis. When we say awesome today, we don't really mean what was implied when that term was originally coined. Inspiring awe, right? That's a very numinous kind of term. Now we're like, cool, you got pizza? Awesome, right? It's like a very different connotation. And so when we read this term in these texts, we might have a very different kind of overlay that we apply. Now, in my movement into Eastern traditions and Eastern cosmologies following my time in Christianity, I really understood, because those traditions really do preserve this notion that words themselves, notions, concepts, never do justice to the ultimately numinous reality. So they'll say things like, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. What they mean by that is, we are pointing at it. We've got like these pointers into the fog again, like I mentioned earlier, but don't make the mistake of assuming these words and these concepts that are reducible to human conception do justice to the actual reality. They tell us something and they help us navigate, but don't assume it's a fundamentally true and sufficiently holistic way of considering that. So when you start thinking about that, then even more so this notion that we went from active engagement with entities to something like a text that we can for then on look at it like a constitution or something, is kind of leaves a lot to be desired. All right, so we've said a lot about that. Let's move on to the next one, which has to do with our origin. So not just how our shaping happened, but actually this notion that we might be an engineered versus a naturally produced kind of being. We've touched on this a little bit, but let's maybe discuss this a little bit more. Because what it's tied to, inevitably, is the prevalence of the humanoid form that we encounter with these others. This, again, makes many people in the mainstream just say, can't possibly be true. There's no way that aliens would look like bipedal humanoids. That sounds like science fiction, and not even good science fiction. It sounds like bad science fiction that's not taking into consideration the fact that different planets have different evolutionary constraints, and therefore life would emerge to look very, very different. It might look so different that we might not even recognize it as life. So the fact that these people with these silly notions and vivid imaginations are telling us they're encountering beings that are humanoid with 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 eyes, a nose, some semblance of a mouth, etc., it must not be true. It must be either delusion or fraud or something else. But of course, if you take into consideration what we said earlier, and this goes to Nathan's point about the islands, you have to sort of like move from one to the next to the next. If you start realizing they've been here all along, perhaps even predate us, then that begins to call into question, does Darwinian theory really explain how we came to be? And is the fact that we see this prevalence of humanoid forms suggestive of the fact that actually we are an engineered species, one of many kind of prototypes that follow the same typical kind of form?
Yeah, this is one that can be pretty challenging. Once you start looking at it more closely, you do wrestle with some of these concepts. So I think as a newcomer to the idea, the easiest approach is to say, well, these are just humanoids from other planets, and the humanoid morphology is just the common morphology of advanced life in the universe. And if you think about that a little bit more, you kind of go, that doesn't really make much sense because, so our morphology is unique to this environment, and yes, there might be other Earth-like planets, but they have different gravities and different compositions, and so why would the bipedal, sort of morphology be the one that would emerge just kind of everywhere? Also, why are the beings in many ways a lot like beings that are on the Earth? You have accounts of reptilians, you have accounts of mantids. I mean, these are creatures that have corollaries in our current day. And so you have to start wondering a little bit more about this notion that they might be from other planets. So you're telling me there are mantis beings that, they're praying mantis on other planets? I mean, there could be, but it starts to get a little bit stranger. And then you begin to wrestle with this notion of, well, what if they all have been here all along? And I'll say that human beings are an incredibly intelligent species, but we are also incredibly ignorant when it comes to the past. We really only have a very small sliver of the past that we've recorded and that we even understand. I mean, even with things that we have recorded, that we have ancient texts that we revere. We've talked about a lot of that already. We don't necessarily understand what those things mean in the context of when they were written. We like to think that we do, but we really don't. And so that's not even that long ago. So you add to this notion that we've got millions and millions and millions of years, billions of years that the Earth has been around. It's a lot of time for things to take place. It's a lot of times for different species to be here, different technologies and civilizations to have arisen. And this is something that has been touched on in the Silurian hypothesis. Parado Kastrup's article touched on this as a possibility, in fact, one that he was leaning towards. So I think this is becoming, for me, a much more palatable explanation as to where these beings emerge from, and that the Earth may, in fact, be host to. It may be kind of the womb or the cradle of all of these different kinds of entities. And when I think about it from that perspective, it becomes, quite frankly, much more fascinating to me than these beings having arrived from other planets. The fact that they have maybe emerged from here and that we cohabit together, that makes Earth much more interesting and mysterious, and raises so many more other questions about not just the Earth, but its place in the wider universe, and why are we all occupying this space together. So I find it to be incredibly interesting. I can't go as far as to say it's definite. We talked a little about this before we started recording, where I might fall. So if you're a listener that has trouble thinking, I don't know if I can really go there, well, understand that I can relate to that. I have difficulty fully committing to some of these concepts, in part because I've not had direct experience with many of these entities. But do I think it's plausible, possible? Absolutely. And I think it becomes a compelling part of the overall narrative once you give it some real concerted thought. I think it can explain a lot of what we see here.
Agreed. And it's interesting because one thing that has been suggested about some of our sciences, especially our soft sciences, is that, again, there's a preference to assume that we have all the ingredients to understand how things have formed, that anything that could have happened, we have the capacity to know about it by studying archaeology, anthropology, geology, these kinds of things. And, of course, what this calls into question is all of that perhaps there's a history that's much, much more ancient than we've assumed. And like you said, it could be that even sophisticated intelligences rose up at one point in human history and then basically either disappeared or moved on somewhere else, or remained perhaps in the caverns of the earth or in the depths of the ocean, or somehow either were this way already or developed the capacity to kind of in a frequential level exist right alongside us, but in a way that we don't usually perceive. This is something we'll get into a bit more later on when we think about where this is ultimately lead, because one of the aspects you have to really take into consideration here is the difference between what we can perceive as human beings and what actually is in our environment. Not even things that are theoretically in our environment, but for instance, the electromagnetic spectrum we perceive something like 1% of. And other species on the planet have a much wider bandwidth that they can perceive. So it's silly for us to assume if it's out there, I would see it. We know there's many things that we can't see that are actually there. There's evidence, for instance, that some of these UAP do actually leave a radar signature, but they're not visible by the pilots that are looking right in the direction of where that radar signature is. So again, big difference between what we can perceive and what actually is out there. All right, here's another one. And this is the thing. If you've been in this topic for several years at least, and you've been willing to go wherever the data takes you, and you inevitably end up in these different areas. And I think if you are listening to us today and you've not entertained any of these, then you might want to look at your own process, because when you just connect the dots by reading books and participating on social media to the kind of conversations that are had, you inevitably come across these concepts and see that they're somehow connected. The question becomes, how are they connected? So the next one I want to introduce is this notion that we don't just have spacefaring, sci-fi-like kind of beings and kind of origins described, and not even just interdimensional in terms of like a multiverse and the notion that they might just be coming from a parallel universe. And that would explain how they're popping in and popping out like Valayan people like that first suggested in the 1970s. But we also see some sort of overlap between this kind of more sci-fi notion of extraterrestrials and the occult or secret societies or religious history that talks about celestial beings that seem to be on a different level altogether or a different domain altogether than this physical plane. Now, again, we went through a long period of time where we would have said this notion of different planes is silly. That's old religious language. Doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, we recognize that this does make a lot of sense, actually. And there's numerous dimensions in different kinds of theories, string theory, M theory, that posit many different kinds of dimensions. And of course, that's just within our notion of space-time. And later on, we're going to get into the fact that space-time itself is probably a shadow on the wall of some deeper structure. But let me turn this over to you before I give some of my thoughts. When you initially came across this notion that somehow the occult and occultic practices and ceremonies and whatnot could actually make contact with beings that might be either the same beings or somehow connected to these beings that we're talking about here within the UFO phenomenon, what did you think about that? How much of a stretch was that? And where do you entertain it even now?
I think initially it's sort of difficult to merge these things together. I think that if you're exposed to these concepts of the occult, here I'm thinking of things like ghosts, apparitions, mediumship, discarnate entities, light beings. These are things that are not necessarily biological in origin. So if you're exposed to that literature in any way, and you're also into UFOs, you sort of let these things run in parallel, almost in their own lanes. They don't necessarily interlap at all. They just, oh, well, this is interesting over here, and yeah, there's UFOs over there. And you don't work necessarily, at least I didn't, work to integrate these two types of phenomena and ask the larger question, could they in fact be related? And if they were related, how could they be related? How could that be possible? How could a reality that I occupy make room for all of these things? So I would say initially it's very difficult, at least it was for me, to incorporate this kind of other aspect alongside the traditional humanoid form, biological entity conception. But over time, particularly as we begin looking more at the consciousness aspect, it is also ways we pursue things like you've touched on about human perception, things that quantum physics has touched on, that our mathematics has certainly touched on, that there are these other layers to reality, these other dimensional facets that are most certainly there, that we just can't necessarily interact with them. That once you begin looking at that, you then make space, like you kind of make a little room at the table for these beings. And now it makes sense. I can have the whole feast and everyone can be present. It can all work together. And I know we're going to touch on idealism as well when we kind of get to that metaphysical model that makes much more sense of how these could all work together. So I do think it's very plausible. And again, I'm going based on not just the accounts of these experiences for the people have shared, but also what our science has even started to posit as being part and parcel to the way reality functions. So you kind of bring all these things together, and yeah, it certainly can work, and very likely is part of the equation here.
Right, and I think a key part of what you said there is in reference to the metaphysical underpinning of all these matters, because we've mentioned many times in this podcast idealism and why we lean that direction. I think what we're doing here is bit by bit, piece by piece, demonstrating how that becomes a very comfortable kind of terrain to land a lot of these things, because some of the notions become commonsensical, almost intuitive, once you consider reality from that perspective, which is difficult to do because, again, we've been propagandized, brainwashed, if you will, sometimes purposefully, sometimes not, in a time, in an era where physicalism has been the dominant paradigm. And so this is what this phenomenon does so frequently, is it basically obliterates the foundational assumptions of that model. And that's exactly why it's existed on the fringes for so long. Because perhaps if we were more scientifically objective, we might say, interesting outlier data here. Perhaps we should question our model of reality. That's not what we do. Instead, we say, sorry, doesn't fit with the model, can't be real. And it's only once you have a sufficient amount of outlier data that a certain group of scientists, not even the majority, will begin to ask questions. I was saying to you before we went on the air that Thomas Kuhn found this in his study of how scientific revolutions happen, that you don't see science begin to objectively consider data, and as outlier data begins to emerge and build, it slowly shifts towards a new perspective. What you actually find is one group that has been around for a while and has a very crystallized sense of how things work, stick to that. They double down on that perspective. And a completely different, usually new generation of scientists begin to entertain a new model. And at some point, those two emerge as coexistent, but completely not able to converse with each other because their very foundations are so asymmetrical to each other. So then what actually happens is eventually the old group just dies. They just physically die. We pass from one scientific paradigm to another, funeral by funeral, as the saying goes. So this is just, again, speaks to, I think, how much human frailty comes in here and our inability to look objectively at things. Again, we want to be somewhat compassionate here and acknowledge that there's so much data out there. We have to take shortcuts. We have to find ways to navigate a complex world, especially with busy modern lives. But the downside to that is that we miss many of these other opportunities, and it's sometimes only once it's staring us in the face and battering us over the head that we begin to really take it seriously. Now, all that said, let's talk a bit more about this notion of occultic practices and how that might factor in to somehow be part of the same overarching endeavor as the UFO phenomenon. Interestingly, when you think about the Collins elite, for those not familiar, this is a group within U.S. government, within the military-industrial complex, within the intelligence community, that basically holds to a fundamentalist Christian perspective. That being that any kind of entity that is not human and not one of the animal species must therefore either be an angel or a demon under this very specific notion of how reality works. And because, at least initially, there are some things that seem disturbing and discombobulating, they quickly lead to the assumption that it must be demonic. Now, what's interesting here is that the Collins elite would even go so far as to say, and this just shows you how much your foundations, your initial assumptions, determine the way you will paint the entire rest of the picture. They will actually claim that this guy named Jack Parsons, who was a rocket scientist in the 20th century, who did some of the most cutting-edge research and development on rockets and was used by NASA and whatnot, is responsible for basically the dawn of modern ufology that began, say, around 1947. But they don't think he was the author of that because he was doing research into rockets and space and astronomy and whatnot, and astrophysics, but actually because he was delving into the occult, that he was a protege of Aleister Crowley, who is famously known as one of the most occultic practitioners in modern history. And basically the notion is that Jack Parsons was engaged in some sort of occultic ritual, and in the process of doing that, he basically opened a portal that allowed these evil beings from this other realm to come into reality. And that is the origin of the modern UFO movement, where again, because in these notions, these beings are always very deceptive, the idea of them being space aliens is just a ruse, that really they're these evil, nefarious entities of a spiritual nature coming from hell, basically, that are here to deceive humanity and ultimately rob us of our eternal souls. That literally is their perspective. That's literally a group within the U.S. government who has taken that perspective. And Luis Elizondo's talked about this, that these are the very people that asked him to shut down the investigation altogether, because from their point of view, to even look into these things is to crack open the door a little bit more for those beings to come through that door that Jack Parsons and people like him opened in the 20th century. So In this notion, we don't just have an overlap, we have a completely different conception of what UFOs are, what aliens are. How is that going to land in terms of us grokking and metabolizing, again, to use that word, this notion, knowing that many people will not take in this information and try to adopt a new paradigm, but will rather try to fit it into one of their existing paradigms?
Well, first of all, that's unavoidable. It's going to happen, as you well know. It's happening now that people, and that's what it should happen. We bring ourselves to these things. We can't sort of disembody our context, our upbringing from the world in which we find ourselves. So it absolutely is going to be part and parcel to the interpretive products that emerge following disclosure, should that happen in an official capacity. And what I find interesting about that is not only the different forms that it will take, because it will take many different forms, and we see many of those represented in the community of interest now, but we're going to see some forms that become more dominant than others. And the ones that become dominant really tell me more about where our culture is at the given moment, more so than anything else. It says, we are, as a species, predominantly still living in this contextual bubble, and this interpretation is the most comfortable for us. And what you know and I know is that we all have to start somewhere. You can't just get to the end point, whatever that may be. There really is no end point after all. But when you start this journey, it immediately begins challenging that assumption. And so, do we have the tools? Is the questions that I ask. Do we have the tools at our disposal to comfortably work through the discomfort which will come? And I don't think we do. I don't think we're very well equipped to wrestle with these challenges that are going to come following our initial interpretations. I totally understand why many people think that this could be a demonic a force. It could be something that is tied to the occult. I absolutely understand that. And when you've been immersed in that kind of cosmology and ideology, then why would you not think it's that? But on the other hand, if you just sit with it long enough and really open yourself to it, you realize that it has to be more complicated than that we've sort of flat-landed it, we've one-dimensionalized it, and we're going to have to make room for a much greater degree of complexity. And look at how do we handle complexity now? Really, really poorly. I mean, really poorly. I would argue that we're living in a day now that we are the least equipped at handling complexity than we have been in the last few hundred years. And that's really unfortunate. We certainly find ourselves in these self-reinforcing bubbles all the time, realities that are just the most comfortable to us. And we've got to find ways to break out of those, to kind of move out and beyond that and get to the place where we can have honest conversation about the complex nature of reality and the complex way in which we are. We can't just approach each other and say, well, Darren's this and I'm that. We don't agree, therefore we can never talk to each other. We really got to work on how we relate, not only to each other, but also even to ourselves. We've got to give ourselves more charity and in the sort of complexity of beliefs that make up who we are. I mean, how much better and healthier would we be if we're willing to give ourselves that kind of room, as opposed to making us have to fit within a certain specific way of being. So this is a difficult one, and I think as much prep work as we can do, and I hope that our podcasts are helping in this regard, it's still going to be very challenging for many people to work through some of these stages, and this one will be particularly challenging.
Right, and so that word that we discussed in the beginning, indigestible, comes to mind again. And I think what you just outlined there points to this, that, again, it has less to do with the nature of the information as it has to do with whether or not our paradigm has a place for that information. So what I find interesting is when people heard Semi-Van utter that term to describe this, they immediately jump to indigestible means it's bad news. It's somehow some reference to some nefarious beings that is so detrimental to the human future that you can't even swallow it. It's just too much to take in, which of course is interesting because that's a very slanted, particular way of interpreting that term. And again, it speaks to what I said earlier about when we're wired to be on the lookout for traumatic experience and threats, we will find them even when they don't exist. And we will take ambiguous data and interpret it through that threat narrative. So it's very interesting because indigestible, and again, I'm really thankful that Lavenda, right after some event, and helped break out that term a little bit more, means different things to different people. Primarily, it just means you can't metabolize it. Very much fits with that term that I used. You don't have a way to incorporate the information and integrate it somehow. You made a great point that we are probably less capable of doing that now than ever. Again, I would ask people the question, is that by accident, or might that be by design as well? That there may be some sort of control structures that are deliberately, slowly but surely trying to create scenarios where human beings are more in echo chambers, less able to sit with ambiguous data, less able to patiently, calmly, peaceably listen to each other. When you're not able to do that, you become very easily controllable, and it can still be done in such a way that gives a semblance of free will. So this is something I would want people to think about. Something else to introduce here, maybe we can sort of land here now in the final few minutes of the episode, is around what this means about the nature of reality. Because I remember you even pointing this out, and I maybe even picked up a hint of it in what you were saying just then, that I think someone coming from a Christian tradition, even if they become kind of post-Christian or they're kind of more universalist now, and that's just one avenue or one route they see as sort of arriving at this ineffable ultimate reality, that to some people the term occult itself sounds kind of negative, sounds a little bit dark. There are some people in Christian traditions who literally assume it is and use that term almost like a slur, basically. And all it basically means is it's technologies to tap into deeper aspects of reality. And these secret societies and these different traditions that have looked into this are basically just trying to do that. And if you start, again, coming back around to this notion of idealism, that basically everything is just consciousness, different modulations of consciousness, then it makes sense that certain practices could create different modulations of your own consciousness and the people you're working with that would allow you to tap into other configurations of consciousness, because that's ultimately all there is. So once you take it out of this frame of there's the natural world we live in, which is quote unquote real and physical, and then there's these dark realms and heaven, if you get beyond that and you just say all there are is many, many different dreamscapes, different configurations of consciousness that sort of simulate the boundaries and the borders of that particular realm, but that is porous because, again, it's all modulations of consciousness, which you can toggle, which you can manipulate. And by doing that, you allow yourself to tap into different elements of reality. And that, as we've said before on this podcast, if we are all fractal impressions of source consciousness, then we have that capacity already within us. And it's only our limited thinking that prevents us from realizing that. But once you realize that, then it makes complete sense, not just that through occultic, that is inner technologies, could you tap into these other kinds of realms, but that in that sense, extraterrestrials, interdimensionals, extratempestrials, the beings that are coming from the future potentially, all of those would be achievable. Those kinds of ends, those kinds of destination points would be navigable through this kind of process because everything ultimately is consciousness. So once you start thinking about it that way, you realize that the occult, the cosmos, inner realities, all of these things are just different ways of describing different modulations of consciousness. And if people even think back to all the elements we described today from that perspective, I think they start realizing that each of these is not only possible, but perhaps even intuitive once you see it from that perspective.
Mm. Okay, I love that you kind of called this out. And I do think that absolutely, when I was raised to think about occult, I was raised to think about it in a very specific way. But really, when you start looking at it in the way you've just defined it, you realize that there are many things that believers do which fall into the same practice bucket. We just haven't called them that. So the fact that you are praying, to an entity, and you're asking for some sort of intervention, from that entity. And think about how often this happens in our current culture, and how commonplace it is at sporting events is a great example I like to use. Help us win this game, because, this matters to you, divine, being for some reason who wins this sports game. But it's a pretty common practice, and we don't think of that as an occult practice, but it sure does fit the same definition. And so once we expand our perception and awareness of really these practices that we all participate in various different forms, you may not pray, but you may, sort of exercise other kinds of non-conventional modalities to influence the reality that you find yourself in. At least you have a hope that it might influence that reality. Then you're doing it. We're kind of participating in those things. I think of this too as you were talking about. There are all these different nodes that are accessible to us in the reality space, and it just so happens that we, in our conditioning, have convinced ourselves, that's the way to think of it, that there aren't all these nodes out there, that there are really only a couple. Like, we can only really get to reality through these couple of different avenues of interaction. And like you're pointing out, no, there are many nodes. There may be infinite nodes by which we can interact with facets of reality. And by virtue of participating in that interaction, by interacting with it, we make it manifest in a way that it had not been before. Before, we were blind to its presence because we just weren't looking. But now we are looking, and we are seeking, reaching out, and it is reaching back to us. And I wonder why that is. Well, because reality is in fact very much participatory. It is very much a process, and it requires engagement and relationship. And these are things that happen all through these types of practices. So it's really, really fascinating, and I think brings so much more onto the table than we had before. And honestly, this is where it begins to get pretty uncomfortable, I think, for folks that maybe are comfortable just in the UFO space and comfortable in the entities or humanoids. This is where it starts getting into territory that is kind of foreign landscape. When we're talking about consciousness and nature of reality and how it's much bigger and stranger and different than just this conventional sci-fi way of thinking about the topic, that's where you start losing a lot of people and where it becomes much more challenging to digest.
Very true. And I think what this really comes down to highlight what you're saying at the end there, is we have this stubborn notion that our waking state reality is somehow different, is more substantial than all of these other things we're talking about. These paranormal realms, these paranormal experiences, these other dimensions, these states of consciousness we enter when we're on psychedelics, or even when we get into deep meditational states. We assume that those somehow are fun and something to entertain, but at the end of the day, you have to return to the nuts and bolts true reality, which is our waking state. And again, I would just point out that people like Donald Hoffman have really made the case squarely, soundly, that is just not true. That is a bias. That is a prejudice of our perception. We only experience the world and can only measure the world, can only set up experiments in the world through our perception, right? Through our perceptual apparatus. And on top of that, because we're all the same species, we share the same perceptual apparatus. And he would argue that everything we're doing, not just in how we act, how we observe, but even how we measure, everything has to do with basically measuring our perception. So physics becomes not the study of reality, but the study of our perception of reality. And even there are mathematical proofs that he's put together with his colleagues that demonstrate that the chance that we're actually experiencing something that is actually a one-to-one relationship with base reality is precisely zero. He makes this point regularly to just point out to people, this is not just saying that we are perceiving a tiny slice of reality, but that actually that slice we're perceiving is more like a desktop interface where you have a trash icon and folders, things that look like those things anyway, but actually underlyingly it's transistors and voltages and things like that. So there's not even a semblance of what is actually going on. So once you start realizing that, you realize that this is just a dreamscape, as are these other realms and states of consciousness we encounter on psychedelics or in meditation, through breath work even. There's these different protocols, which you could call occultic kind of protocols, because it's all about these different procedures we use to help modulate consciousness. And what you really have to move away from, I would argue, is this notion that somehow this waking state one is the base reality and the rest is just a fun mixture of things you can entertain in a kind of an imaginative way. That's an assumption that has been demonstrably proven untrue. That's the key here. I think I would really encourage you to read Donald Hoffman's work, see what he's saying, see how well it's supported. The challenge is we spend most of our time in this waking state experience, and we, again, share the same perceptual apparatus. So the way he describes it is like we're all wearing the same VR headset. And if you spend any time with a VR headset, and then after a period of time you take it off, you realize, wow, when it's immersive, when it's actually incorporating all of my different senses, which over time VR will get better and better about not just seeing, but smelling, tasting, touching. When that's the case, you at some point fool your brain and you start believing that's reality. That's why you see these hilarious memes of people running into walls, because they forget that the VR headset they're seeing is not the reality that they're in. But the point is that even that is another kind of layer of the VR. And so these different beings are able to, some of them anyway, move between these different VR kind of simulations, so that when I have discussed before, for instance, the fact that even this hard line that we assume exists between the living and the dead, that also is not really existent. And as Hoffman says, it's not principled. There's nothing to say that that's different. It's just that our particular VR headset doesn't have the capacity to render a human being that's passed into that different state. So it's the limitations of our headset, not something that's ultimately truthful about reality itself. And not only are people like Hoffman and Kastrup pointing to these things, but fundamentally, this is what the UFO phenomenon does for us, is it points out the reality of these things, that these gray aliens can easily interact and bring into our awareness supposedly deceased loved ones, not because they are able to simulate that being, but because this is a simulation, and our inability to usually access those kinds of people is a limitation of our headset, not something fundamental about reality itself. So this is why I think this is the ultimate topic, because it makes you ask all of the questions, all of the deepest questions, and not just ask the questions, but providing really tantalizing details that begin to paint a picture that, to use your word earlier, is not just remarkably different, but much more interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's an incredibly fascinating journey to be on. I think that it could be very challenging to find yourself in the midst of this paradigm, because we're all very comfortable with the one that we know. And it turns out we've spent 98% of our time really with the one that we know. And even the dreamscape that we're all familiar with, the dream world, we all have them, but even the dreams have a quality that is analogous to the world that we would find in our waking state. And I'm using air quotes there because these are, as you point out, these are just different states of reality. They're not, they're really indistinguishable. It's just that we've given them distinction. And so on this, I want to point out that it's really important to embrace, I think, the power of symbols and analogies and different modalities, different mythologies, even ways of interpreting these facets of reality. I almost think of them like little software packets, right? Sort of like, how does it help me engage with this other aspect of reality? Well, I'm going to use this little software packet, this little metaphor that helps me reframe how I might find myself engaging with that facet. And it might help me to dissolve my sense of self, and get that out of the way, or dissolve the paradigm that I'm rooted in and get that out of the way, and begin asking the question and embracing the question, the reality that this other aspect is very much just as real as what I left behind. And I would argue perhaps that that's what our ancient relatives have done, that they have done that by writing down these mythologies as means by which they can commune with these other aspects of reality. And we've just gotten to the place where we've said, we don't need that. The only reality is this one right here, and I don't need those things anymore. But look at the wisdom that we can find in these ancient traditions that open up this huge sort of tapestry of possibility. And I would encourage all of us to re-examine that and even kind of create your own ways of interacting with this space. And Darren, you have done a lot of this stuff in guided meditation. I think that creating a landscape, a space in which you can place yourself and interacting with this aspect of reality that is not what you're accustomed to really does begin to make that a possibility. And so I would encourage folks to kind of play with these ideas a little bit and see where they take you, because I'm convinced, I've experienced it myself, that they will in fact take you places into realities that you didn't think were possible.
Absolutely true. And I think just to close here, I'd say that when we consider all the elements we discussed today and how each of them are sort of incrementally more difficult to metabolize for the mainstream, this is the final one, the ultimate question point that we arrive at, which is, what is the foundation of all that is? And I would just suggest to people that while this might at first be discombobulating, it might be overwhelming, it might feel unmooring, I think what I would want to encourage people to realize is that this is much more adventurous, because it basically says any of the hard lines you think exist are basically just artifacts of the particular modulation of consciousness you're employing right now. And as I've been saying in different podcasts and in my classes and whatnot, to address the challenges we're facing as a species, which are made more difficult for some of the reasons you pointed to earlier, that we are less open, less flexible, less conversant with each other than we used to be. Because we're facing those challenges, what this possibility offers us is something fundamentally different. What this basically says is that beyond the external manifestations we see in our quote-unquote physical world, to use your air quotes again, what's really going on there is a modulation of consciousness, and that we are collapsing one particular world space into existence over another through our collective consciousness. So the ultimate occultic practice, or inner technology, if you will, is that once a species begins to not only recognize that, but also recognize that they are connected fundamentally, that even this notion that you are distinctly different from me, ultimately separate in some fundamental way, once you realize that too, it's just a way that the consciousness is modulating, then it makes you playful, makes you open-minded, makes you encouraged to begin to take seriously your own power. Because again, I keep coming back to this notion that we are ultimately all fractal impressions of source consciousness. That means we have access to the whole. We can modulate the dials. We can dream into existence the dials that determine the parameters of the realityscape once we really open our minds to this. So this is the opportunity. And I think this is tied into, as I keep saying, the times we're living in, that it's not just about the fact that we're trying to make sense of who these beings are and have some sort of official politician declare it from a podium sometime, but that rather that's tied in with the cycling, spiraling kind of chaos we're seeing in the world, as well as these different notions about cataclysms coming, these kinds of things. It's tied in with these beings, and not just the beings, but the fact that these realityscapes seem to be merging together. It's amazing how many people I'm hearing talking about this sense that the veil is thinning, which again sounds more like a religious kind of perspective. But again, if it's just about a modulation of consciousness, then it's almost like two galaxies begin to rotate around each other and begin to now become one galaxy. So that seems to be happening, where the very configuration of our overarching consciousness worldscape is changing. So that's what I would encourage people to do. Be open-minded. Notice when you start feeling threats, start noticing feeling uncomfortability, and ask yourself, is that the way it has to be? Or is that just because I have been trained to see the world in this perspective? So the opportunity here is immense for us, and it's exactly the kind of opportunity that can help us rise to the challenge that we're facing as a collective.
Well said. Well, I enjoy thinking about how the space we create here intersects with the space of our listeners, because I believe it is very much a dynamic relationship, that we're kind of co-creating this together. It's not just that you and I come into these conversations with a list of bullets and there we go, we've done our podcast. The conversation is very much alive as we go through it, and it's alive not just in the way that you react to my commentary, I react to your commentary, but it's alive in response as well to our listeners, which I know is a strange concept to consider, but I think that it is happening. I think there is this interplay between the listener both now and whenever they might listen to it, and even before in linear time it's occurred. There's an interplay at work there that makes and builds what we call this podcast, this sort of adventure we're sharing together. So when I think of it that way, and I think about other interactions I have with people around me in the same and similar way, it really opens up, for me at least, a very dynamic and alive and fantastic way of looking at reality, and not just kind of approaching it from what am I bringing to this, what am I bringing to the table, what's all about me, instead it's about what is this entire enterprise. So hopefully that is a little food for thought as we end the show. Really do thank all of you for listening and for the feedback that you provided. It really is helpful for us. We love reading that, and anyone who shares the podcast, that means a great deal to us. Thank you all for your support, and we look forward to having this conversation again the next time. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits, and we'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.